A couple of things that may be useful to other people. Your colleague was asking a couple of questions just now about the letter of motivation for Erasmus. And this doesn't just apply to this particular thing, but also to job applications. The first one is keep it fairly short, keep it clear, keep it simple. You've got to remember that the people who read all these letters have to read, a lot. Maybe, I don't know how many of the applications. I think there are several hundred applications every year. So if it's 2 pages, it's too long. So 1 page, why you're interested in Erasmus, why you think you're suitable for it, what are you interested in. It doesn't have to be in that order, you can put it in the order you like, but I think basically those are the key things. And how are you going to do it? Because we need to know whether you can finance it yourself or whether you need to have a bourse. So it's the usual questions, isn't it? Why, where, what, and how. So that's my advice, anyway. The other question that came up, which may also be useful, is a bit difficult to get why there's common law and equity. Why is there common law and equity, and is that something that's troubling other people, or is it reasonably clear? Okay, well, if you want me to go back on that, then we've got another couple of sessions now, so I can always take a quarter of an hour and we can go back. Maybe we should say for the last session or the last hour of the last session, if you've got points that you find are still unclear or you'd like me to go over again, then let me know. So we were talking about interpretation in the English courts, dealing with European materials. I'd just like to read you a quote. You don't have to write this down, just to give you the flavour. And it was a case in 1974, so just after we entered the European Community. And this was a case called Bulmer versus Bollinger. It was about champagne cider, because in the southwest of England we have people who manufacture or make cider. Bulmer is a well-known maker of cider, and they wanted to call one of their ciders a champagne cider, because cider is still or is fizzy. And of course Bollinger, the French champagne manufacturer, objected to the use of the word champagne because it's recognized in Europe as an original denomination. And this was the first time, or one of the first times, the English Court of Appeal had to deal with the interpretation of European instruments. And he said, when we come to matters with a European element, the Treaty of Rome is like an incoming tide. It flows into the estuaries and up the rivers. It cannot be held back. Parliament has decreed that the treaty is henceforward to be part of our law. It is equal in force to any statute. Beyond doubt, English courts must follow the same principles as the European court. So there you have it. As from 1974, that was what the Court of Appeal was saying about European law. But does that remind you of something about law flowing up the estuaries and into the rivers? I quoted Helen Cam, the Cambridge professor of English legal history, who was talking about folk right that came across, Anglo-Saxon custom that came across the North Sea with the Danes and the Saxons. Okay. So we've had some fun with interpreting European legislation. One of the most famous examples is a case called McCarthy's versus Smith, which concerned equal pay between men and women. And the English legislation said that there would be equal pay and this is what the legislation, English legislation said, where a woman is employed, and the word is should be underlined, on like work with a man in the same employment. And if you use the traditional English method of interpretation, the literal grammatical interpretation, the result would be that the employer would only have to give equal pay where it employed men and women in the same employment at the same time. Where it employed men and women in the same employment at the same time, because of the word is in the legislation, where a woman is employed on like work with a man in the same employment. And that's what the employer was trying to argue, to resist a claim for equal pay by a woman who had been employed subsequently. So wasn't employed in the same employment at the same time, but was employed to do the same job subsequently. So the employer was saying, well, we don't have to give her equal pay. And the employee, of course, was claiming that that did not correspond to what the European legislation was trying to do, which was trying to ensure that for the same job, women should get the same pay. So, fortunately, the English court said, well, yes, that's quite right. The European interpretation would be much broader than the strict literal interpretation. I think that's probably enough about European Union law. So I think we'll just stop there on that subject. I think we need to say a few words about European Convention on Human Rights. So we need a new section, European Convention on Human Rights. Just give me a minute, I have to put my glasses on. Sorry, technical problem. Here we are. I managed to break my glasses last week, and I do this once a year, so they're now being repaired, and I have to use my old glasses. And after a while, I just can't see anything anymore. Right. So, first point, which I think you've had before, but just repeating it, is that the UK Parliament legislated to bring the European Convention into English law with the Human Rights Act in 1998. Previously, British citizens had the right of recourse to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg once they had exhausted their remedies in the English courts. But before 2000, which was when the Human Rights Act came into force, before 2000, the convention was not part of our legal system. The first thing that the Human Rights Act does is to require institutions and officials to comply with the principles of the Convention. And it enables the courts, the second thing is it enables the courts to declare UK legislation incompatible with the Convention. And to declare that acts of the administration which do not comply with the Convention are illegal. The Act also enables the courts to treat secondary legislation as invalid if it is not compliant with the Convention, unless the primary legislation prevents the court from doing so. Now, you are probably saying to yourselves there's something a little bit incoherent there. How can you bring the Convention in and have legislation that doesn't comply with the Convention? Well, remember the principle we've talked about before, that Parliament is supreme, can make law as it wishes, so that it's possible for legislation to be passed through the Parliament and still not be compatible with the convention. Now, that may happen because the government wants to pass legislation through the Parliament and is prepared to take a risk. And when legislation is introduced, when a bill is introduced, I should say, there has to be an explanation of whether and how the legislation is compatible or compliant with the convention. But that doesn't prevent the courts later from deciding that the legislation is incompatible. If the legislation is incompatible, then the government may decide to pass legislation to repair the difficulty. What the Act has not done is to give the Convention superior force of law in the UK in the same way as the law of the European Union. For example, the English courts are not bound to follow decisions of the European Court of Human Rights. The Human Rights Act says that the courts shall take account of the legislation, which is not the same as following. In reality, the courts do, as far as possible, follow the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights. One other important section in the Human Rights Act is Section 3(1). Section 3, subsection 1, which says that UK primary and secondary legislation is to be interpreted so far as it is possible to do so. So far as it is possible to do so. In accordance with convention rights. That means that the English courts can use the same principles of interpretation as are used by the European Court of Human Rights. That includes the principle of proportionality. And the principle of proportionality has enabled the English courts to develop their case law on judicial review. The English courts have also decided at the highest level, this was the Appellate Committee of the House of Lords in 2003, that the courts may also look at ministerial statements made to Parliament during the passage of the bill through Parliament and particularly about any questions of human rights. Just to give you one example, there's a case called Gaydin, G-H-A-I-D-I-N, Gaydin, G-H-A-I-D-I-N, versus Godin, G-O-D-I-N, Mendoza, M-E-N-D-O-Z-A, which was decided in 2004. The court was examining the right of the survivor of a same-sex couple to continue a tenancy of a flat. So tenancy, T-E-N-A-N-C-Y, location, yeah. The UK legislation gave a husband or wife the right to continue a tenancy taken in the name of the other member of the couple, married couple, so that if you took a literal, strict grammatical interpretation of husband or wife, you would not be able to say that that would entitle the surviving member of a same-sex couple to continue the tenancy on the death of the other member of the couple. What the House of Lords Appellate Committee decided was that the legislation should be interpreted in a way which would avoid a discriminatory effect so that the court could interpret the words husband or wife in a wider way than the strict literal interpretation. Okay, so that's really all I wanted to say about European law, and it's actually much more than I thought I was going to say. We have been going through the sources of English law, and I said there were two other sources of law, right? There's international law and custom. So we've just got time. You have 5 minutes to do those last two sources, and that will bring us then conveniently next week to look at constitutional law. So international law, I have already said a couple of times that we are a dualist state, so that to implement international treaties into our legal system, there is a two-stage process, which is, first of all, ratification of the treaty, and secondly, the passing of national legislation to bring the treaty into effect in the British legal system. One can give many examples. The United Nations Charter, the European treaties, and then some very specific treaties like the treaties that deal with carriage of goods by sea, carriage of goods by air, Hague Conventions, in practice, it is also important to be aware of international norms, so that in the field of international business, norms which have been developed within the scope of the United Nations on human rights, on slavery, on trafficking of human beings, you will now find in many international contracts specific clauses which integrate those international norms into international business and contractual practice. There was a case I would like to just mention briefly, which was called Al-Jeddah, A-L and then Jeddah, J-E-D-D-A. Which concerned a British national who was of Iraqi origin and who went to Iraq during the period just after the Gulf, I think it was the Second Gulf War. And he was arrested by the military authorities and accused of terrorist activities, and then was held for some considerable time in a military facility in Iraq. And the question which he brought before the English courts was whether he was entitled to the protection of the European Convention on Human Rights. The British government pleaded that the British military forces were acting under the authority of a United Nations Security Council resolution. And they pleaded that that gave them superior legal authority to detain Mr. Al-Jeddah and keep him in detention. And that should prevail over the European Convention. The case went to the European Court of Human Rights, and there it was decided that the United Nations Charter itself contains provisions that are not dissimilar to the provisions of the European Convention on Human Rights, and that that it could not be expected that the Security Council, in giving authority to the British and American governments to deal with the situation in Iraq, had at the same time withdrawn the protections that are contained in the United Nations Charter. So that enabled the European Court to say, well, the Convention continues to apply. But it's an interesting case of interaction between international law, European law, and national law. The last source that I want to talk about then is custom. And I think I've already mentioned, but I'll mention it again, is that custom in this sense refers to local custom. And if you travel about in the United Kingdom, you will find that there are many local customs. They may relate to such matters as rights of common. In other words, the rights to use common land in a village. The rights to pasture, to pasture animals. And you will find that the vocabulary that is used in relation to those common rights is quite often feudal Norman French. The right to pasture animals from dawn is called levancy, The right to pasture animals at night is couchancy. Levancy and couchancy. You don't have to know that, Dan. You won't get a question. So very specific local customs. The other one, I think the example I gave you already was the fishermen hanging out their nets to dry on a piece of beach in the North Sea. All these customs have the same force of law as common law, legislation, European law. So they can only be removed by legislation. So if you are Total and you want to build a pipeline onto a beach in the North Sea, you will have to check, are there any local customs that might prevent me from doing that? Although business custom is not strictly local custom in the same sense, I always mention business custom as a source, because in reality many business contracts are regulated by business customs that are specific to a sector of business, to a market, or in some cases to a particular location, like a port. So markets and ports are examples of business operations which have local customs. If you sail your ship into a British port, you will automatically be considered to have accepted the custom of the port. And each port has its own customs. If you are trading on a London commodity market, you will be considered to have accepted the customs of the market. And if you're doing business in a particular business sector, you will quite frequently find that the contracts, the written contracts that are entered into, don't write down everything that enables the contract to function properly, because business people know the customs of their sector and they don't necessarily write them into the contracts. But if there's a dispute, if there's a problem which in some way prevents the contract from functioning properly, then the courts may imply a condition which is necessary to make the contract work. And that may well be custom of the trade, custom of the business. You'll be looking at that with laws in the second semester, I think. So I've gone over the time. We meet again here next week. And this time I promise I will start constitutional law.